Happy Saturday. It's August 3rd, 2024, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in Paris.
And I'm Michael Haney in New York City.
And it's been another intriguing week in the news. Victory for Biden. Not quite the electoral triumph he was hoping for, perhaps, but still. His administration negotiated the release of 16 people from Russia, including the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. He'd been in prison for the past 16 months. The former Marine Paul Whelan, arrested in 2018, was also released. It's a big moment for Biden and yet another success in what has been, by many accounts, a very impactful term. Meanwhile, in Kamala land, Brat fever has taken over. Not only are her supporters doing Charlie XCX's viral Apple dance, but the neon Brat green has officially become the color of the summer. At Airmail, we are also getting in on the fun, greenwashing our branding for the week. That's just the beginning of the good times we have in store. But as usual, Airmail is your antidote to all of that news.
Absolutely. And we have a great show today, packed with wonderful conversations and great insights. First, if you've been through Nice, France, you are no doubt familiar with the legendary Palace Hotel there, the Negresco. And our man in France, John von Southern, has his report on the question on everyone's mind in the south of France. Did a Tom Ripley-like scammer convince the deceased owner of the hotel to leave her $500 million fortune? He will tell us all. And then, speaking of scandal, the literary world was shocked by the recent news about the late author Alice Munro, the Nobel Prize-winning writer, in which her daughter alleges Munro's second husband sexually abused her as a young child. Daphne Merkin, a writer at large here at Airmail, will join us to discuss her encounter with Munro and what she learned about the writer. And finally, the world of Olympic equestrianism was rocked by the recent leaked video of one of its brightest, most decorated stars severely whipping a horse. Can the sport ever recover? Pippa Cuxon will join us from the UK to explain how this happened and what comes next. So Ashley, where would you like to begin today?
Well, Michael, we have to start with France. It's Olympic fever happening in Paris right now, which explains why I'm back for a second weekend. Have you been watching it on TV?
Of course. Come on.
Well, it's interesting because we've been following this story for months, if not years. And there was so much naysaying about the grand ambitions of this event. And I was really fortunate to be here for the opening ceremony last weekend and to get to watch a few of the competitions. And I wrote about it in the issue this week. But it's among the more magnificent things I've ever seen in my life. I mean, do you get that sense from watching it on TV? It's just the grandeur and the scale of it.
Of course. And I think, as listeners have heard me say many times, how can it not? You've got the most photogenic city in the world with the greatest athletes, the greatest physical athletes in the world. And I can only envy you being front and center.
It was so wild. I was fortunate to be invited to the opening ceremony by a friend who works at Chase, and they have taken over this boat on the Seine right by the Pont Alexandre Trois, that big golden gorgeous bridge near the Eiffel Tower. So we were watching the opening ceremony from this pop-up lounge that they'd created on a barge. So yes, it was raining outside, but we were inside this boat and it was kind of drizzling and we were watching all the boats go by. The coolest thing was that you could really see the expressions of these athletes who were just so thrilled to be there. And yes, it was raining. And yeah, there were some technical issues. Yes, the opening ceremony was delightfully bizarre. But what I loved so much about not just the ceremony, but about the scale of this event and the ethos behind it was that in France, usually the answer to everything is c'est pas possible. It's not possible. But this time they just kind of went for it. I think it's like a little bit of insanity and an awful lot of joy that created these Olympic Games against, I'm really happy that they didn't listen to their more rational, better angels. It's really thrilling. I have to tip my hat. Good luck, Los Angeles, is all I have to say.
Bar has been set.
All right. Well, Michael, while we are on the subject of Paris, let's bring on Pippa Cuxon. She is a journalist in the UK and was previously an editor at Horse and Hound magazine. She's been very active in all things equestrian for the past 40 years, perhaps even longer. And she brings us a fascinating story of a scandal rocking the world of dressage. Welcome, Pippa.
Hello. Yeah.
So, Pippa, all eyes are on the Olympics in Paris at the moment, especially the horse competitions that are taking place at the Palace of Versailles, which is such an extraordinary moment for the sport. But there's been a bit of a cloud over the entire affair. Tell us about the latest scandal in the sport of dressage.
Well, dressage is still a very kind of aesthetic sport. And it's quite interesting because it is usually one that in the past has very much been dominated by continental Europeans, particularly the Germans and the Dutch. And then in about the past 3 or 4 Olympiads, Britain has suddenly sort of come from nowhere in this sport, if you like, and largely thanks to veteran team member Carl Hester and his protégé Charlotte Dujardin, who sort of appeared on the scene from 2011 onwards. And then she won the Olympic gold in 2012 with her lovely horse Allegro, and again in 2016. And the sport in Britain was really, really on and up. Everybody was very thrilled because she and Carl had been pioneering a rather kind of lighter way of riding dressage, which had become quite sort of hard and domineering on the horses as practiced by some of the Northern Europeans. And there were many, many concerns about a particular practice called roll cur, which is quite a way of riding a horse into quite a harsh position. And everybody was very thrilled with Carl and Charlotte's achievements because they didn't practice this technique. And then only a week ago, we all completely had the ground cut from under our feet because Charlotte Dujardin was caught on video simply whipping a horse. And it turns out that even if she obviously doesn't practice this awful training technique of roll cur, she apparently misuses her horse in a different kind of way that none of us had ever seen before or even expected. So just the sort of actuality of it has been awful, but the fact too that it's Charlotte, everybody's just so shocked because it's just basic striking of a horse that doesn't understand that it's what it's being asked to do. And so, of course, the whole kind of house of cards, if you like, has come tumbling down.
Pippa, as you report in your piece, the incentives to cut corners in this particular arena are huge. Tell us about some of the tricks that horse dealers have used in the past to maximize performance from their animals.
Yes. Well, I mean, a lot of horses and most horses that you will see jumping and doing dressage and already that have completed the cross country would have been trained in a perfectly nice, kind way, because horses will do things if you have got the time and the skills and the patience, because they are quite simple souls and they learn very much by repetition and memory. If you're prepared to put the hours, weeks, days, years in, you can still get the same results. But because there is a lot of money to be made from selling these horses to people who can afford to buy the ready-to-go version, if you like, the temptation to take the shortcuts are really quite, well, the incentives to mess around are quite huge. And even in times gone by, 100 years ago, longer than that, old horse dealers used to do all sorts of things to try and get a better performance out of a horse. And nowadays they are slightly more sophisticated. But in dressage, for instance, there is this overuse of this training technique known sort of euphemistically as roll cur, but it's also described as hyperflexion by those who try to make it sound possibly not as severe as it is. And this is a sort of quick fix way of getting the horse to go in the kind of rather rounded outline that you see the dressage horses going in. Their sort of backs rounded and their necks quite arched and their heads tucked in. And being forced to go like that does have a number of physical impacts on them, the most obvious of which is the symptom is when its tongue, because of allegedly being cut off from the oxygen supply because the head is overbent, the tongue then lolls out of the side of the mouth and turns blue. And then for other types of equestrian discipline, the ones that are known, obviously the ones that involve jumping, there's still a practice which is banned, known as rapping. When it's in training, when the horse jumps the fence, somebody will sort of not strike. It doesn't necessarily have to be a whack, but touch the horse's legs with some kind of pole or a bamboo cane or something like that, just to make it flick its legs higher out of the way. And that's generally thought of as unethical. And it is banned under the rules of most countries and by the FEI. But from time to time, prominent riders are accused of doing it and even end up in the sort of criminal courts or civil courts, various actions brought by animal rights campaigners. And then sometimes, again, banned, but people are clever enough to get these things kind of secreted, if you like. Well, the horses' protective boots that they wear on their legs, they can sometimes have a very clever device as part of the construction. And as they jump the fence, the kind of mechanism of the boot pinches their leg, and then they'll flick their leg out of the way so that they really clear the fence. That's generally thought to be unethical, and a lot of horses have boot checks now by stewards before they even go in the arena because they can't be sure they're not wearing these things. And some of it is really quite subtle and some of it is a little bit more obvious, really. But the governing bodies are constantly trying to keep one step ahead of the next development. It's quite sad, actually, that it does go on at this level. And if you've been involved in the sport as long as I have, which is over 40 years, things seem to be getting worse rather than better in an age when we should be more enlightened about the way we treat animals is quite tough to swallow, actually. I felt very sad about it for the past week, that it's come to this.
So, Pippa, how is this conversation now affecting the viability of some of these equestrian sports at the Olympics?
Well, I think some people think it's probably going to accelerate a process that might have happened anyway. I would be incredibly sad to see the sport dropped by the Olympics, because by the vast majority of riders who do it properly, it is a wonderful thing to show this relationship between the rider and horse and what they can achieve when there is this is incredible trust, but between the pair of them. But very much governed now by the social license to operate, and that's become quite a big sort of buzzword in the equestrian world, and very conscious that the general public sees things in very absolute terms and they don't like to see animals being abused. The horse world does still seem to have this kind of, oh, we've always done it this way. And a lot of them still can't see what the issue is. And somebody referred to, I saw somebody, a friend of mine mentioned the other day that it was just a sort of form of cognitive dissonance. And I think it is. It's just nobody really knows what to do. And the sport has been somewhat at risk of being removed from the Olympic programme on and off over the past couple of decades, not so much because of the welfare issues, but because it is incredibly expensive to put on. And what helps is that the next Olympic Games is in the US and the next one after that is in Australia. And those are both countries with a huge horse heritage and record of doing incredibly well, both countries in Olympic equestrianism. So there is a good chance that those organisers would argue the case for keeping it. But the IOC can't be happy at all about all this incredibly negative publicity. And who knows what discussions are even already going on between them in their hotels in Paris as we speak about whether or not this is viable to carry on.
Pippa, if you could change one thing about how the sport is organized or organizing itself and what it's doing, what would you want to see?
I just wish the governing body, which is the International Equestrian Federation, the FEI, based in Lausanne in Switzerland, could try to regulate. It's not very good at enforcing its own rules on the field of play. I just feel that there is an awful lot of the sort of gently or softly catchy monkey sort of tactics to try and persuade people to abide by the rules and do things in a way that is now more acceptable to the wider public, not just the way equestrians have already done it. That hasn't worked. We've got to the stage now where our reputation, frankly, could not actually be any worse at the moment. So I would like to see them make, in the short term, more of an example of people who have committed quite a serious rule breach or not exemplified what we want to see from riders and the respect that they should show for their horses, who are meant to be their equal partners. There is no deterrent for riders when they do things wrong, and I just feel we need a little bit of that. Yeah, we are the only sport in which there's two different sentient beings, and we have to remember that one of them didn't ask to do this and actually is at all times doing his best. And if something goes wrong, it's because we've got the messages wrong to the horse. Something's gone wrong in the communication. They're not born naughty. If they do something wrong, it's usually just their honest mistake. And we have to remember that. They're not machines.
Pippa, thank you so much. It's a very sad story, but you've told it very movingly.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before we veer too far from the topic of France, let's bring on John von Southern. He's a writer and frequent contributor to Airmail, also the author of Monsieur Mediocre, and he is here to talk to us about, yes, that's right, Michael, another scandal, this one plaguing the Hotel Negresco, one of the Grand Dames of Nice. Welcome, John.
Hi, guys. How are you?
How did the story of the Negresco come onto your radar?
It was interesting. I was contacted by one of the family members who are contesting the succession of a woman named Jeanne Augier. The person in question that contacted me, I think is a fifth or a sixth, I guess what you would call separated cousin from Jeanne Augier. Now, Jeanne Augier was the owner of the Negresco Hotel, which is the five-star palace located in Nice along the Boulevard des Anglais, overlooking the Baie des Anges. The hotel is kind of shrouded in controversy now that Jeanne Augier has died, because Jeanne Augier died without any heirs. And so that's kind of where we picked up, was with the family members who were contesting the will of Jeanne Augier.
And who was Jeanne Augier, John?
Well, maybe it's easier if I go back to the beginning of the Negresco. The Negresco Hotel was built at the beginning of the 20th century by a Romanian violinist named Henry Negresco, who started with nothing and worked his way up as a kind of maître hôtel along the Riviera and in Paris. And along the way, he befriended a lot of rich people like Rockefellers and the Singers and the Aga Khan and got them to invest in his dream of building a sort of Ritz palace along the Côte d'Azur. And he pulled it off. He hired the architect of the Moulin Rouge to design it. And in 1913, the Negresco opened. Unfortunately, it opened a couple months before World War I started. And Negresco was kind of stillborn. It was converted into a military hospital. By the time it reopened, Negresco was bankrupt and died soon after. And for a long time, the hotel was kind of haunted and lay in ruin. And then it wasn't until the late 50s that Jeanne Augier, who was a young girl at the time, her parents bought the Negresco and converted it into what it is today, thanks to Jeanne.
What made the Negresco so special is it's one of the last French-owned five-star palace hotels, not only on the French Riviera, but in the entire country, right? I mean, it had such a unique personality, or has such a unique personality in a particular place in the landscape.
Yeah, correct. In a way, under Jeanne Augier's stewardship, it kind of became a kind of five-star Chelsea hotel, which was kind of wacky, yet decadent and opulent at the same time. There were stories of Salvador Dali walking through the hotel with his leopard. Paul McCartney wrote Fool on a Hill on the Negresco letterhead in a room. Elton John filmed the video, I'm Still Standing, in the hotel. Michael Jackson had a dance floor put into his room next to his suite in the Negresco. And it always had this kind of funky vibe to it because Jeanne Augier was a patron of the arts and had a giant collection of art throughout the hotel in each and every room. And I think that's what made it so unique in a way. But it was French owned. And Jeanne Augier always maintained that she didn't want to sell. She even had bids by Bill Gates, who had left a check at the reception saying, name your price. And I think that's kind of what's at the crux of this controversy is why is the Negresco being held up in court, and is the ultimate game to keep the Negresco one of the last hotels French-owned, one of the last palaces that is French-owned? I
mean, John, this has so many echoes of the Bettencourt affair, right? Where Lillian Bettencourt had this handsome, young, charming protege, and towards the end of her life ended up leaving a lot of money to him. How did that play out here in the case of Jeanne Augier?
Yeah, it's interesting. It does echo to the Bettencourt scandal a lot. Towards the 1990s, the late 1990s, early 2000s, Jeanne Augier, like many people who get older, started to have diminished faculties, and her role of running the Negresco was more ceremonial. She had actually even moved into the Negresco and was living up on the 6th floor in the cupola of the hotel. And in comes a young kind of dandy named Pierre Couet, who is a student from the École de Louvre, which is a very prestigious art school. And Couet and Jeanne Augier hit it off. And all of a sudden, everybody is kind of shocked that Couet has a job at the Negresco, and not just a job. He's kind of one of the higher ups at the Negresco. I think he had a title as cultural advisor. And as the years go by, Couet starts taking a bigger role in Augier's life. Augier becomes a little more isolated from her family, from the rest of the management. There's a point where kind of Couet is kind of calling this shot. And this is kind of where my piece kind of picks up, is in 2009, Pierre Couet draws up a will for Jeanne Augier in which he leaves all of her assets, namely the Negresco, but there's a lot of other stuff that the Augiers owned, a villa in Nice, several apartments in Nice, bank accounts in Switzerland and Luxembourg. And all of this, according to the will, will go into a sort of foundation that Couet and a few other people will run. And that's where everything kind of starts to unravel.
So, John, how many different parties right now are warring over this estate?
Well, it's interesting. Couet is being charged with that kind of grab-all accusation called abus de faiblesse, which was used in the Bettencourt scandal as well, where an elderly person with diminished faculties is being taken advantage of by somebody for financial gain. Couet, I have to add, has been acquitted twice, but in France, you can still be retried after being acquitted. And the prosecution wants one more bite at the apple, and it looks like the trial will happen in this fall. But one of the parties in particular is the family. Now, the family is saying by French law, even if we are distant cousins, we are family. And by rights, we are the heirs to the Negresco Hotel. And they are challenging the will. They are saying basically that Jeanne Augier was senile at the time of signing the will and had no idea what she was signing, and that Kuwait influenced her into making this foundation and to putting all of her assets into this foundation so the family couldn't have it. And that's where chicken and the egg comes in of like, when was Ogier lucid? When was she not? And up until now, the family has yet to prove that she did have Alzheimer's in 2009 when the will was signed. And there's also speculation that the French government and the French justice system doesn't want to dig too deep into the will, because then that would open up a whole can of worms in terms of who the actual heir of the Negresco is. One of the lawyers told me it seems the French prosecution is just happy to have a crook inherit the hotel instead of having the family, because at least the Negresco can stay French.
And by staying French, John, if the family were to get control of it, most likely, because there's an inheritance tax of 60% in France, they most likely would sell it. And as Ashley noted in the introduction, it would be the end of one of the family-owned palace hotels, and it would go to like a hedge fund or some other chain, and it would sort of pass out of French ownership, right?
Yeah, exactly.
John, what are some of the possible outcomes of this case, which is going to be taken to the highest French court in the fall?
So he could be found guilty of certain time, or he could be found innocent. And in that case, which it gets really kind of wild, is that Kuwait then can conceivably return as head of this foundation that he set up back in the day. And since he's the member for life, he'd be the head of the foundation, and he'd invariably, almost in a way, be the heir to the fortune of the Negresco and run the Negresco. And so there is kind of like a Saltburn quality to this whole thing of like the guy isolating the widow, dispatching all of the enemies that are trying to do the same thing, and ultimately achieving his goal of inheriting the grand house.
Well, John, thank you so much. It's a great story. Incredible reporting. I mean, you had such amazing access to it. So I encourage everyone to go read it. It's a tale for the ages.
Oh, thank you guys. Thanks for letting me try it out. It was a pleasure doing it.
Well, let's move from one scandal to another. This one takes an even darker turn as we discuss the life and times of the writer Alice Munro and why she's been in the news most recently. Daphne Merkin, a writer at large for Airmail and the author of numerous books, including the memoir This Close to Happy, A Reckoning with Depression, as well as the novels Enchantment and 22 Minutes of Unconditional Love, is here to offer some insight into the writer we all thought we knew. Welcome, Daphne.
Hi.
So Daphne, Alice Munro has been in the news lately for reasons unrelated to her literary accomplishments. Can you briefly talk us through the story?
I actually had heard about the story before it broke because her daughter, her third daughter, is three daughters. The youngest daughter, Andrea, Alice Munro, remarried when she was in her 40s, a man named Gerald Fremlin. Think Gerald Fremlin. And the youngest daughter, Andrea, went every summer to stay with her mother. I guess he was, I don't know if she saw him as her stepfather. She stayed in the summers with them, and Alice Munro's husband had custody of the three daughters for the rest of the year. And Andrea Skinner, as her name is, wrote a piece. It appeared on a website, an organization for victims of child sexual abuse. She wrote a piece about her Fremkin, Alice Munro's second husband, sexually harassing her when she was 9 years old. That went on for a long time. The whole story came out when Andrea was 25. She told her mother, she told Alice Munro about the whole incident, and Munro responded, at the very least, you could say quixotically, or you could even say chillingly. She somewhat was competitive with the daughter, or trying to make it sound like the daughter had competed Fremlin's affections. She briefly left her husband, Fremlin, and then came back and said she needed him. She loved him.
Daphne, you're one of the few people who's had experience with her. I mean, you've spent time with her. You spent 4 hours interviewing her for the profile that was published back in 2004. How did you find her?
I found her surfacely charming. I quote her as saying, "My charm has a time limit," kind of open to a degree, but not someone who wanted to reveal much about her inner mechanisms. I thought at the time that she told me very little, but I later realized when I look back at the piece that she actually did talk about her husband a lot, Fremlin, and what he meant to her. I think in the piece I say to her that he sounds like the love of her life, and she says he is. She also told me, I think she's very conflicted about how much space, psychological and literal, to take up with her writing. She doesn't have a famous Virginia Woolfian of her own. She writes at the dining room table. She said I met with her in a little bar in a tiny village, 3 hours from Toronto. Originally, she said, yes, go and take a look at the house. Then she changed her mind. And I just looked at the outside, had a garden filled with Fremlin's artwork, sort of strange, call them art objects, like outsider art, interesting stuff. But the whole garden was his, and her contribution were the flowers. So the garden seemed like a shrine to him. And that was the overwhelming sense I had was he was her link, far less than her daughters. She said at least once that she hadn't really wanted children. I mean, I don't think, forgetting about even overlooking what happened, I don't think motherhood was her calling at all. And one could argue, which I sort of do argue in my piece, that she sacrificed the daughter's welfare for her art.
You make so many insights in your story this week that prove so revealing, and you say Monroe sort of confessed to you that she had, quote, no moral scruples, really, and we can see these things obviously clearly through hindsight. I'm also sort of left kind of chilled by your encounter with Fremlin at the end, where she sort of seems almost submissive to him. How do you square it all now with Monroe and look at her?
To sort of answer initially with a truism, people are complicated. I think Alice Munro was probably particularly complicated in the sense that I think she remained, despite all the acclaim, conflicted about being a writer. I think I say in my piece that she thought there was something unseemly about standing in the center and, as she puts it, giving your version of things. I think part of it was her own conflicts that he helped resolve. Gerald Fremlin, the second husband, had been an early detector of her talent. He had picked out a story when she wrote a story for a magazine, a college magazine, when she was, I think, 18 or around that age, and he had picked it out as showing great talent. So in some ways, he was her first fan. And it was a sort of devil's bargain that she was affirmed by him. She needed that affirmation. I think, though she was also strong in her way, I think she couldn't live without that.
I just want to note again that there was her daughter at the center of this, and who was the victim of it, and has been struggling then to reveal this to the world. And seeing your story from 20 years ago, she said it helped her understand the layers of how her mother kind of moved through the world. Very powerful.
The daughter wrote me that I portrayed, or Alice Munro portrayed Fremlin as so gallant.
In retrospect, the clues to Monroe's nature were there all along in her work, perhaps. Like most writers, it's there. We just don't know the layers to put on top of it in order to see what they're telling us.
Yeah, although, to be honest, reading back into the stories is a tricky thing. I talked to the editor, Charles McGrath, who brought her into the New Yorker, and right before I was writing the piece, and he said he was astonished that he did not see it in the stories. He did say that he thought Set was the baseline of a lot of her stories. Women who either were in compromising marriages. There are stories about women who, there's one famous story, to Runaway or Mandel, about a woman whose husband mistreats her and harasses the daughter, and the woman stayed. So I think you're right that if you do look at it with that scrim, with that film on, she circles these issues a lot.
Well, it's a tremendous story on your part and great insight across the decades to look at her and this horrific piece of the family story and her daughter. I encourage everyone to read your story because your thinking that you bring to it and the insights are terrific. So thank you very much for sharing it with us today.
Daphne, thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. AML's Arts Intel Report, our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it, is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world,
recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
All right, Michael. Well, it is the weekend. I know you've got an exciting way for us to fill the time.
I do, and it's called the Olympics. I mean, how can I suggest you watch something scripted when you have the best dramas happening right now, unscripted, riveting, inspiring dramas? And you, my dear, what do you have?
All I've been doing is watching the Olympics and talking about the Olympics and thinking about the Olympics.
Well, that's not sadly. It's occupying all our minds. What are we going to do? Like watch Wolverine and whatever that other movie is? No, come on. Superheroes, you got the kid who came off the chair to just win the pommel horse.
Oh my God, Steven Adorasek. I know, he was incredible. I saw him in the preliminaries like last Saturday. He was next level even then.
Yeah, I mean, so if you want drama, what are we going to recommend? We're going to recommend movies and other things that are like, this is unscripted drama happening in real time. It's the best kind because you don't know the ending.
It's so wild. We went and saw beach volleyball last weekend. And I mean, Michael, I don't want to say it was more fun than the Taylor Swift Eras tour, but it was close. I mean, the announcers were so incredible and they were riling up the crowd and they had these acrobats that were coming out in between points and there was a DJ and commentary in French and English. And it was just completely wild and wacky. And I was like, this is a sporting event. Like the French have clearly taken lessons from the New York Knicks because these guys really know how to put on a show. But that venue, it's so sad that it's going to disappear after the Olympics. But watching the sunset over the Eiffel Tower while you're watching beach volleyball play, it's like the best thing in life.
It would make it even better can you have like a glass of rosé in your hand as you do it?
Interestingly enough, the venues are alcohol free. I probably should have written that in my story, but...
Quel scandale. What?
Quel scandale. Well, they're trying to keep things civilized. And actually, it's such an orderly games and everyone is behaving. There's so much help around. If you ever need directions, there's someone there to offer them to you. So I actually think it's a great idea. And I got to say that non-alcoholic 1664 beer, absolutely delicious.
There we go.
Well, we wish you all a wonderful weekend full of sports, and more sports. Michael, will you please read us out?
With pleasure. Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan. And our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan Keene, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We'll be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting. But in the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music. But most of all, thank you again for joining us.